The Trojan Saga, Part 3. The Iliad ends before the end of the war, so we don't actually see the beginning of the war, or the end of the war, or the fall of Troy in the Iliad itself. We get most of these stories from some other texts, other stories, other compendia of classical myths, but we don't really have one collection of all the stories together that tell the entire story of Troy. So the pieces we'll have here come from different collections. After Hector, of course, Achilles has to die. He surrendered his life and his future for the sake of his friend Patroclus and getting revenge and seeking glory. How does he die? Well, being the greatest warrior of his entire generation, the greatest warrior of the greatest war, it's only fitting that he should die at the hands of the coward, Paris. Right. He had offended Poseidon by killing Poseidon's child, and he had offended Apollo for a whole lot of things. Basically, Achilles had offended all the gods in one way or another, except probably Athena and Hera. But it was Paris who was chosen by Apollo to be the bearer of the arrow that kills him, which is also fitting because Apollo is an archer god, and Paris is an archer himself. So Paris, then, is the one who fires the arrow, guided by Apollo, that goes into the heel of Achilles and causes his death. After he dies, there is a great conflict between Odysseus and Ajax over the armor. Who should get the armor? And they decide to have a speech contest for this, which is kind of odd for Ajax, of all people, to get into a speech contest with Odysseus. Odysseus the wily, Odysseus the crafty. Of course Odysseus wins, and this causes Ajax to go insane. In some of the stories, actually in most of the stories, he tries to take vengeance on the Greeks themselves, and he wants to kill them all. But Athena turns him insane, and instead of Greeks, he's killing sheep. And the graphic scenes where he's tying them up and torturing them. And eventually he finds out that, they're not sheep, or they're not Greeks, they're actually sheep. And then he feels ashamed, and he knows that everyone's going to laugh at him. And so, in the horror at his deed, and the horror at his inability to exact vengeance, he kills himself. And the death of Ajax, the suicide of Ajax, is a big plot line for the end of the war. And then, of course, Paris dies, and Paris dies at the hands of an arrow. Not that he would ever be in the front line fighting with a spear or a sword, but he dies at the hands of an arrow, which is fitting. After the death of Paris, the Trojans are short on heroes, but the Greeks are no closer to overcoming their walls, because they still have that central problem that walls are just hard to get over. But Odysseus steps in, and Odysseus has a plan. The plan is to build a really big horse, and to put Greeks inside of it, and to pretend that they've gone away. And then the Trojans will be so happy at winning the war, they'll bring the horse inside, and the Greeks will be inside. Classic Trojan horse, we all know the story. How it works is, well, they build the giant horse. They take the entire fleet, and they go and hide behind an island where nobody will see them, and they leave one guy behind named Sinon. Sinon is tied up, and he's part of the trick. Sinon has a story that the Greeks have left, they've given up, they know they can't win, and they left that wooden horse there as an offering to Poseidon, who is, of course, a god of horses and a god of the ocean, and it's supposed to help them have a safe trip home. Now, they completely believe this, and everybody says, well, great, we've won the war. What should we do with this horse? And people say, well, maybe we should destroy it. But others say, you can't destroy a gift to the gods. We need to bring it inside and honor it. Because the Trojans are, even though they've committed the unholy act of defending Paris after he ran off with another man's wife, they are a holy people. And Priam is a great believer in the gods, and he is devoted to them. So they want to do right by this offering to the gods. But a priest runs down, a priest named Laocoon. And he has this great line. This is out of the Aeneid. He has this great line, I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts. And become a classic line about how you shouldn't trust your enemies, even when they seem nice. Maybe especially when they seem nice. And then he takes the spear, and he throws it as hard as he can into the wooden horse. And it hits it, and it, boom, makes this big resounding noise. Sounds kind of hollow. But just as he does that, a giant snake comes out of the water, slithers across the beach, and eats him and his children. And everyone is just standing there watching in horror, and they don't know what to do. All they know is this guy insulted the offering, the horse, and then snakes ate him. And so they're left with this image, and the only thing they can do is to bring the horse inside. And in a lot of the stories, the horse is too big to get inside. Purposefully, the Greeks made it too big to get inside. So they actually had to dismantle part of their front gate in order to get it inside. So they've dismantled part of their wall. And so now the horse is inside, and the Greeks just have to wait. Once it's inside, there's kind of an odd story where Helen goes around and mimics the voices of the wives of the various Greek heroes to try to convince the men inside the horse that their wives are outside. Some of them almost talk, but then they're held back by their compatriots. And this is one of the troubling things about Helen, is that she's able to switch sides very, very easily, and we never really know where she is. In this particular case is one that gets brought up in the Odyssey later on, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Helen, it seems at this point, is trying very hard to help the Trojans overcome the Greeks still. But of course, she fails, and they just have to wait. And then after everyone's asleep, the Greeks come out, and then they attack the city. And this leads to the sack of Troy. The best depiction of the sack of Troy comes from the Aeneid, and that's the section that we read for today. It's a terrible scene. It's violent, it's bloody, it's horrifying, and you see all just the terrible things that go along with the sack. Now, the Aeneid is written by Virgil, and Virgil's a Roman, and the Romans knew a thing or two about sacking cities. So myself, I always think that this reflects the sacking of a city, what it looks like when the Romans actually overcome a town. It's pretty brutal and pretty violent. And then you see all the horror, all the horrible things that happen here. And so characters that we've come to like or admire, or we want to see them get some sort of a happy ending, some sort of a peaceful resolution, they don't. Priam is killed by Neoptolemus, also called Pyrrhus. Now, there was a prophecy that they couldn't overcome Troy until they brought Achilles' son. Achilles' son is Neoptolemus, sometimes called Pyrrhus, depends on who's telling the story. And he becomes the chief hero at this point then. He's taking over where his father left off, and he is a gruesome figure indeed. Now, this is a terrible story where he kills Priam's sons in front of him, and then Priam is clinging to an altar. According to tradition, you cling to an altar, you have sanctuary. No one's supposed to kill you on an altar, but Pyrrhus doesn't care. He grabs Priam by the hair and drags him, slipping in the blood of his own kids, and then kills him in front of the rest of his family. You might remember Andromache and Astyanax. Astyanax is Hector's child, and they throw him from the walls of Troy, and they dash his brains on the rocks below. Andromache, Hector's wife, well, Pyrrhus takes her for his own woman. So that's the end of Hector's family. Priam's wife, Hecuba, is filled with rage and grief and horror of all the things that have gone on, not just by the Greeks, but she also faces betrayal by Thracians who are supposed to be allies. And she's so overwhelmed by grief and horror that, according to the story in Ovid, she actually turns into a dog. And even the gods feel terrible about her fate, someone who didn't deserve any of this. But one thing we see in Greek mythology is that the terrible things that happen to you aren't necessarily because you deserved them. If you are bad, you will be punished for the most part. But just because you're punished doesn't necessarily mean that you were bad. Aeneas, on the other hand, the last great hero of the Trojans, he escapes. The gods have other things in store for him, and his mother, Aphrodite, protects him, gets him out of the city, and then he goes off on his own travels that we'll talk about in the future lecture. He wanders around the Mediterranean till eventually he reaches the shore of Italy, and he founds the Roman people. So what happens to Helen in all this excitement? Well, frankly, Menelaus never had any intention to take her back. The whole plan was to go there and then to kill her for her infidelity, for her adultery. And so while they're sacking the city, he goes looking for Helen, and he finds her. And then it's a dramatic scene. he approaches her with rage in his eyes and fury and righteous indignation and all the things that the husband might feel when his wife has left him in such a way, and all the lives and all the deaths that have been brought on account of her. And then he pulls out his sword and he's getting ready to kill her. And then she looks at him and she takes off her clothes. And then he's face to face with her, the stunning beauty that is Helen. And he can't bring himself to kill her. You see in this picture here, he has a sword out and she has her arms open. And then he takes her in his arms and they embrace. And then they kind of live happily ever after, or at least for a long time. He takes her back to Sparta, and I can only assume that they have nice Trojan slaves to go along with them. And Helen is the one person who comes out of this almost unscathed. She just picks up where she left off, leaves everything behind, and carries on with her life as though she had never met Paris. This ends the lecture. In the next lecture, we'll take up the topic of the Greeks returning home.